Nurse Heather MANUS, thank you so much for joining us on an episode of the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to chat with you today, Joe.
Yes, I love what you're doing at the Cannabis Nurses Network. And I think the best place for us to start out would be with your roots in New Mexico and how you got started as a nurse there and working with the indigenous healers. And I feel like that probably led you right down this road.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never went to nursing school to become a cannabis nurse, first of all. But I was blessed to be born in an area rich with a lot of different culture. And I was integrated into that culture and taught by Native American healers and Hispanic curanderas, and really just taught the ways of the medicine that grows in our area and how it can be used to benefit the community and their health and what things were used for and when they bloomed. And so I had this really vast traditional herbalism background before I became a nurse. So I knew that there were ways that nature could heal us. And I brought all that with me as I became a nurse. And it wasn't until I was a nurse and working with patients, specifically in like the home health psychiatric world, that I started to realize how many patients were using cannabis. And that's really what sort of opened up the door for cannabis nursing for me way back when, 12 years ago. So I've been in the cannabis industry space as a cannabis nurse for 12 years.
So tell me what that landscape looked like 12 years ago when you dove in.
Well, in New Mexico, we actually passed a medical law in 2007. And so by 2009, it usually takes a couple of years till you really get the regulations set and you start to see businesses open from the time it's passed. And so by 2009, I was part of a board of directors for a nonprofit producer, is what they're called in New Mexico. But basically, it's a vertically integrated system. So you can do everything with that license, from cultivate, manufacture, and dispense. And so my role at that point was to help patients access safe medicine. I was making medicines because I had patients that were really sick and smoking cannabis wasn't an option for them. So way back then, all we had was flower and occasionally some hash or keef. And for most patients, they needed something more. And that led me to actually ask our Department of Health director of the program for medical cannabis patient program. I said, we've got these patients that need smokeless alternatives. What do we do about that? And he literally told me, Heather, we haven't really thought that far ahead. You're going to help us figure it out. And I'm the kind of person that loves a good challenge. And I did. I figured it out and was the first to have a licensed facility to manufacture products and started creating smokeless alternatives in New Mexico. And subsequently did the same thing in Arizona. So I've kind of spread my knowledge around to a few different states over the years.
Yeah, I like that. And, the biggest roadblock is always education. And it's the education that the patients need. It's education that the lawmakers need and that the community needs. And ultimately, too, like our doctors. And so nurses play such an important role because there's so much that they do for us that doctors can't. So tell me a little bit about that role that you play.
Yeah, so we are patient advocates, we are educators. A lot of times we can be a liaison between a patient and their doctor, specifically in the home health setting. And so it's really important for nurses to be aware of what's going on. And I always say that I learned about cannabis as medicine from my patients. And it was just had other knowledge, external knowledge about plant medicines that left me open to actually hear from my patients and be able to have some curiosity that really sparked that conversation. Once I realized patients were using cannabis, I just started asking during part of my assessment, you always have to ask, do you use any illicit drugs or alcohol, drugs or anything that's not prescribed? And I started to ask, do you use medical cannabis? And just by asking that simple question, opened up a whole new world for my patients to have that way to speak about it, to converse. Because what I found is patients really want to talk about it. They want to talk about how cannabis is helping them.
Yes. And
Health is not so open.
that's true. You cut out just a little bit on that at the end, but at the it's a lot too about the language that you use. Just like you said, I have to ask if they use illicit drugs, but the fact that you change that wording around with the cannabis and call it medical cannabis, and it invites someone to be honest and authentic with you. And, I lived in Texas for most of my life, and I was always very open with my general practitioner, and he knew that I consumed cannabis daily. And people are like, I can't believe that you tell your doctor that, and I'm like, I can't believe that you don't. So will you talk a little bit about the importance of having that open dialogue with your doctor or nurse practitioner about what you're actually consuming?
Yeah. So sometimes what you'll get as a patient when you talk to your doctor, it'll either be one way or the other. They'll either be intrigued by what you're saying, they'll understand the endocannabinoid system, they'll understand benefits of cannabis, and they'll talk to you more about it. The other side of that coin is that they're not educated about the endocannabinoid system, and stigma still runs deep with them. So when they have a patient that will disclose that they're using cannabis, they might actually document that a patient has cannabis use disorder. And so a lot of times patients are a little bit hesitant because they don't know which side of the fence their doctor falls. And so that's where a lot of or they're afraid to talk to their doctor about it because they already know.
Oh, shoot. Heather, you froze. But I'm going to try to remember where you are. Oh, come on. Heather, I'm so sorry you completely
Am
froze
I
up.
froze?
Yes, you were, and you were just talking about, like, what is your advice? How do you help patients get to that point where they understand where their doctor lies on that subject so they can, responsibly answer?
Yeah. So I always tell patients to find an article or some kind of something that's talking about your disease process. Scientific journal article would be best. Go to pubmed.gov and just look up your condition and put cannabinoids in there. And typically, if you can take in just a little research article to your doctor and don't expect an answer right then, just say, hey, I came across this and I wanted to see what you thought about it. Can I leave it with you and talk to you about it during my next visit? But not being confrontational, but just being open in dialogue to say, hey, I saw this science. How do you interpret this? And a lot of times that can open the door.
I like that. I like that answer a lot. And you can do 10 minutes of homework and you're just like, interesting. Will you tell me more about this? And yeah, allowing them to still be the quote unquote authority, even though we all have sovereignty over our own bodies and health and wellness choices. But yeah, I think having that relationship with your doctor that you're really confident in, that's an important relationship in our lives. And so, being able to find a doctor that, fits your vibe and your health lifestyle is important. Do you have any recommendations on how to find that? I mean, do you do something like that through the Cannabis Nurses Network? I know a lot of you are entrepreneurs. How does that work?
Yeah, so with the network, we definitely have articles that are written by nurses. And so they're written in a way that are understandable and digestible. They're not super long scientific journal articles. They're just very pinpointed information that nurses would share with one another. And it's also good information for patients. Go to the Cannabis Nurses Network and find one of these articles, print that off and take it to your doctor and see if you can start to open that discussion.
Yeah, I like that. Now, I mentioned a lot of you nurses are also entrepreneurs. And so I also wanted to just spend a little time talking today about the opportunities for nurses. So nurses that are, curious about cannabis, or maybe their state isn't legal yet, but they're wanting to tee themselves up to be ready for that when cannabis is legal in their state. What is the Cannabis Nurses Network doing to help, organize that opportunity for nurses?
Yeah, we do a lot. And so the mission of the Cannabis Nurses Network is truly to empower nurses through education, opportunity, recognition, and advocacy. And our goal is to help nurses in their professional development within the cannabis space. And there's a ton of opportunity for nurses. They can meet with patients directly and help do patient consults or be a cannabis coach for patients. They can be an educator in universities. They can take on education roles within their facilities. They can be politicians or regulators or advocates in that way. There's so much that nurses can do. You can take the route I took and get involved with the state licensing and get your own dispensary or your own cultivation going, make products, really get involved with the business and the industry. What we've seen is a lot of nurses, when the big craze hit several years ago, that a lot of nurses felt safe enough to say, ooh, CBD, I want to offer products to my patients. And so some nurses are simply just selling CBD products. So really it's wide and vast between hemp and cannabis, what nurses can really do in this space.
Yeah, I like that. And you have the free info and resources on your site, but y'all also offer coursework, right?
We do. And so what part of what we do for professional development is we actually do a Speakers Bureau training program. We're in the middle of a class right now where we take nurses that are interested in improving their speaking skills, public speaking skills. We help them and then give them an opportunity to really exercise and practice those skills through continued education programs that we then offer to all nurses who want to get to know more about the endocannabinoid system and cannabinoid therapeutics. And all of those programs are available to nurses who join up with us. And we have a very robust network where we do a lot of interaction. We have a private space where we can communicate with one another. And it's really grown over the years. It's a really special place for nurses.
I like that. Now, you were the founder of this network, am I correct?
I was a co-founder. So in 2015, we started with about 8 nurses. And by 2017, we actually officially founded the Cannabis Nurses Network with 40 members. And we're upward of over 500 members now. And these are all nurses that are wanting the support in their business endeavors, in their education endeavors. And we're all here. We root each other on at the Cannabis Nurses Network. One person's success is all of our success. So that's really our focus.
I like that. Do you share like case studies with each other to, just kind of help round out these conversations that y'all are each having with your different patients?
Absolutely. We host roundtable discussions with nurses where they can talk about what they're doing, what they're seeing. We host webinars for nurses that have really exceptional case studies to discuss or topics that are special to them. And so, yeah, we do a lot just making sure that everybody is communicating with each other and we know the good work that's being done around the world, really.
Yeah, and you're also really instrumental in the legislative work. Y'all do a lot of advocacy work. Tell me a little bit about what y'all were doing with the Senate Bill 311 here in California.
Yes. So in a couple of years ago, Jim Bart contacted my husband and I and said that his son had just been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and asked if we could help him get some cannabis medicine. And we activated the network. We were able to get him care and cannabis. He was in the hospital. And they had an issue where that hospital said, no cannabis in this hospital. So we had to move him. We had to find another hospital that would allow him to have access to cannabis. And he lived out the rest of his life, which was only a few weeks after diagnoses, but he was able to actually be present and alert and so that he could converse and spend those very precious last moments with his family, his wife, his friends, his parents, his son. And cannabis was a game changer for him in his quality of life at his end of life. And so we started 2 years ago. We submitted to have legislation passed. It was called Ryan's Bill 305 when the first time around. We made it all the way through all of the processes, and it got to the governor's desk. And even though Governor Newsom signed several different pieces of cannabis legislation that year, he vetoed Ryan's law. And so last year was out because they weren't doing anything. COVID took over. But this year we submitted again, and it's making its way through right now. And we're asking for everyone to please let Governor Newsom know that this bill that would allow patients in California to use their cannabis medicine at the end of life in their facility, whether it's a hospice, a hospital, a nursing home, that this is compassionate care and quality of life. And we need this bill to go through and become law here in California.
Absolutely. And there were a couple of little spaces where you cut out. And so, for the audio podcast later, we want to make sure that any patient in California, no matter what facility they're in, whether or not that facility believes in cannabis or not, that they have the right to have that at the end of their life care. Is that correct?
That is it. You said it beautifully. And I'm sorry I cut out.
That's okay. It was just a couple of key words that I was like, I need those. So what about other plant medicines? Here in California, the, entheogens are decriminalized in the city where I live in Oakland. And that's something that the state is considering as well. So as they become more mainstream for medical use, like, microdosing psilocybin or ayahuasca or something like that, where will the Cannabis Nurses Network, will they absorb the other plant medicines in?
Yes, and we're already doing that. We actually had a shaman from Peru that spoke during our conference last year. We had a curandera from New Mexico that spoke last year. So we definitely incorporate those indigenous medicines that are sacred, ancient plant medicine it's now reawakening. Where our spirits, our bodies, our beings are calling for this plant medicine to reawaken us and help us through this next phase. And it's really important that we keep the culture of these indigenous people intact. And as we see medicine starting to take over where it's clinical settings for treatment, I stand on that line of saying, not too fast. Have a lot to learn from traditional healers, and we cannot eliminate them from this discussion. We have to incorporate, and create a complementary experience for patients as they begin to tap into the magic and the power of all sacred plant medicines.
Amen. Absolutely. I agree. And, you had such an early introduction to all of these plant medicines when you grew up in New Mexico. When was that first introduction of knowing that, plant medicine was as much an option as, Western medicine?
I don't ever remember a time of not knowing that plants were precious, special, and having relationships with them. So a lot of the things that I'll talk about is ethnobotany, which is the relationship between people and plants. I have always had relationships with plants. And so learning some of these more powerful, sacred medicine plants, that just kind of came over time as part of my rites of passage, sitting in ceremony, of these cultural experiences. And that's one thing that I want to stress is that these cultures, these plant medicines are used to help nourish and support and keep the community healthy, not just the individual. And so a lot of times as we start to transition where we're doing it just one-on-one, those are individual experiences we can have. But when you have the singing and the drumming and the dancing and the fire and all of the plant medicines in ceremony, it takes on a whole new experience that, in my belief, cannot be met simply by sitting in a clinical setting and experiencing these molecules.
Yes, I totally agree. I'm just smiling. It's this idea too about like, you can I lived the last year all alone, not hanging out with anybody. I'm here, I survived, but I sure as hell had a more fulfilling life when I was in community and with nature and, going out and doing things. So, sure, we can survive, but we're interested in thriving.
Absolutely. And we're going to see this whole, one of my focus typically in mental health is stress disorder. And I always reframe post-traumatic growth is what we're striving for. You don't have to live with this post-traumatic stress disorder. You can actually thrive through post-traumatic growth. And I see that so many people have experienced this trauma through this COVID lockdown in so many different ways that we need this period of post-traumatic growth and being able to not just survive, but thrive. So I love that you brought that up, Joe.
That's so great. I love that post-traumatic growth. That completely reframes it. I volunteer, mentor for SCORE, an organization that helps small business owners. And in a session this morning, I was telling a young entrepreneur that there is a Rolodex of perspectives, and it is our job to just keep flipping until we find the one that serves our higher good and our purpose. And so when you say post-traumatic growth, I've had the visual of my, Rolodex flipping through my head. It's so good. It's really good.
It's all about perspectives, right?
Yes. So, your background was psychiatry, doing in-home health stuff. Let's dive a little bit more into the plant medicine for our mental health. Like, what are some of those, maybe suggestions or things that you've learned during your career that would be beneficial to share?
It's interesting when you talk about mental health and cannabis, we'll just focus on cannabis, that the mental health community isn't quite on board. Right? They feel that it's substance use disorder or cannabis use disorder. And they're a little bit slow to pick up on the fact that cannabis works to help balance our endocannabinoid system. And we have these receptors throughout our entire brain, and specifically in the areas of our brain that control our memories, our fears, our happiness. And so it's when we're talking about mental health, you'll hear, be really careful if someone has THC or if someone has post-traumatic stress disorder, only an indica, not a sativa. And so there's a lot of discussion that goes on with that. But this is what I've found over 12 years of working with mental health patients. Every single person is different. CBD is going to work great for some people. It's not going to work as well for others. And THC may not be needed for some patients, but it is essential for another. You can have two PTSD patients that they require different varieties of cannabis. And so really the way that we approach it, or that I approach it, is you are on a cannabis journey. You have to find what works for you. And so my role as a nurse would be to teach how things work, why they work, and how to out safely. And once a patient has that information, they get to go on a fact-finding mission for themselves. And this is their journey, where they get to find what works for me. And this is so counterintuitive to what healthcare is all about, where we give you a prescription and say, one pill 3 times a day, do it like this. It's a different mindset, but what it's doing is empowering patients to really get in tune with themselves, to start to learn what their body needs. And there's a term called interoception. And that is basically a word that means you're listening to your body. You can hear what your body wants, and you're giving it what it needs. And I believe that cannabis helps us become more in tune with ourselves, And if we don't have a lot of external pressure, like a doctor saying don't use it, or family members that are judging you, or a job that's at risk, or police knocking at your door, if you have all those exterior stressors kind of put to the wayside, and you empower a patient through the use of cannabinoid therapeutics, they will find their sweet spot. They will find balance in their life, and their quality of life will increase, whether it's mental health or physical health or whatever. And so that's kind of what I've seen over my 12 years in this space.
I love it. Thanks for sharing that. Now, you're helping patients with their cannabis protocols while looking at the other medicines they might be taking. So, y'all have a really critical role in helping patients get to that place of empowerment, I would say.
Definitely. And when you're working with a patient as a nurse, we all what medications are on. I always came from the perspective of, okay, what are you on and how can cannabis help get you off of them? But always then saying, if you're going to titrate down off your medications, have those discussions with your doctors. Nurses don't typically do that titration, but we can be that liaison to say, communicate this with your doctor, let them know you're seeing these benefits and you'd like to stop taking that medication, and really helping to keep a robust conversation going.
Yes, I like that, because it's almost like you're their health coach preparing them for their doctor's appointments. It's just like studying for a test. What are the key points I need to remember? And, how do I communicate this effectively? And so y'all, go ahead.
I was going to say, you brought up a great point about there are interactions too with some of these medications. One of the things cannabis does, it lowers blood pressure. So if you're on a blood pressure medication, helping to keep your blood pressure lowered, and now you're adding cannabis, your blood pressure is now getting extra lowered. So what we say is, you may want to talk to your doctor about reducing the amount of blood pressure medication that you're on if your cannabis use is consistent and keeping your blood pressure at a healthy rate. So that's one instance where we want to make sure that we know what patients are on so that we can help keep the medication and the cannabis ratio appropriate for the patient's health.
Yes, I like that. Now I just have a curious question. I find a lot when I smoke that if I'm just working, all of a sudden I feel like I get kind of cold. Is that because of the blood pressure thing that I feel chilled?
Yes, your blood pressure is dropping a little bit, and so you just need to, put a coat on.
Yeah, that's right. I wear a sweater.
Yeah, and another instance of it too is, patients that are on opioid medications, for instance, if they have chronic pain and they're on opioids, they can start using cannabis, whether it's THC varieties or CBD varieties. And a lot of times what they'll find is that they just don't need like that. If they're, taking 4 pills a day, they may only need 3 pills a day. And so it helps to feel more empowered, because one of the worst things someone can feel is like they are addicted to or dependent on a pharmaceutical medication, specifically with chronic pain. They just want to be out of pain so they can live a better quality of life. And I've seen cannabis be introduced and help to reduce those pain medications to the point where it's manageable for the patient to have a better quality of life.
Last week on the podcast, we talked with Denny Cipollini. He's an amputee who became addicted to opioids for 28 years and finally started incorporating cannabis into his life for pain management. And he did what I think is crazy, and just after 28 years was like, I need to feel what it's like to get off of these things. So he just went cold turkey and detoxed that way. But now he doesn't need them at all. He's able to completely manage his pain using cannabis.
Yeah, it's amazing. I love those success stories, and I've heard those and seen those, and it's really wonderful because we all know where this opioid epidemic has led us. I've lost a nephew myself to this epidemic, and nobody should have to lose a loved one to addiction or dependence on a pharmaceutical medication.
Absolutely. So if there are nurses out there that want to get involved, expand their cannabis education so that they can go out and become an entrepreneur in their communities, how do they find you and get started?
Yeah, come and visit us at cannabisnursesnetwork.com. That's where you'll see all of our public information. If you decide you really want to be part of the network and explore that aspect, you can go to our private membership, which is cnnmembers.com.
Here, will you repeat that? You cut out.
Go to cnnmembers.com, that's where our private membership is at. Join up. We'll welcome you with open arms, and you'll find your new cannabis nurse family there.
Awesome. I love it. Well, Nurse Heather, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you want to share or is important to round out our conversation for today?
This has been so much fun for me, Joe. Thank you. We could go on, but we'll leave next time.
All right. Well, thank you so much for hanging out on the podcast. Let me check the notes and see what we have here. So Peter is one of our Casually Baked Tribe members in the UK, and he says, we have the new CAN card. My doctor flat out refused to send my medical records for registration. Doctors definitely need an update here. It's counterproductive. He says hospitals can use opioids, but not plant medicine. It seems ironic. It took me 2 years to grow mimosa plant for, I don't know what he's saying. You should tea blooming. Oh, okay. His dog ate it. I don't know. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff happening in, each state has their own hurdles to jump. And then as a country, and then, this just is kind of happening all over the world right now where everyone is trying to figure it out and get it right. And, the thing that we all need is more education. So thank you for what you're doing to educate, nurses to then go out and do what they do best and just freaking nurture communities and help doctors be better at their jobs.
Yeah, and I just want to end by saying one thing, that this whole cannabis industry, this whole cannabis movement, this is a patients movement that started years and decades ago. And as advocates fighting for their own rights to be able to feel is best for them is what has led us to where we are today, but we're not there yet. So if you're in an area where your doctors aren't being open, try to help them understand about the endocannabinoid. It is the 12th human body system. We did not learn about it in medical and nursing school. And that's part of what we need, is just to have patients say, hey, what about this endocannabinoid system? And start that conversation. Now, I'm not saying it's up to patients to educate their doctors and nurses, but definitely advocate for yourself and come at them with some strong information that cannot be disputed. And every time I talk to a medical provider and I talk about the endocannabinoid system, before I leave the room, I say, and now I know you're going to go Google endocannabinoid system, because that's where it starts.
Yes, absolutely. Start the dialogue. Thank you for that. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for another podcast.